That's really cool to hear. So just sticking on to the operating structure and scalability, because like you said, there is a way of operating in Sri Lanka, kind of people are accustomed to. And when you go to other geographies, they have their regulations, they have their way of working with people. Sri Lanka is more social, maybe another country might not be. They have their own cultural norms. How did you overcome that barriers? How did you do that shift to be successful?
Yeah. So again, at the very beginning, it was again very ad hoc, nothing very formal. Right. I think it was the same teams that were operating. I mean, there was no separate P&L created, no separate revenue lines, no separate budget allocated. Right. So it was relatively informal. Um, but then eventually, you need to start building the structures there, right? I think eventually there were targets that were down for the markets space. There was a separate P&L line items coming up, and then I think one thing, especially scaling and growing, that we really needed ownership. Who's owning this now, right? Who's owning it, and who's I won't say Nick on the line, but um, you know what I mean, right? Someone has to be accountable. So I think assigning that, and then as you grow, you need to put in the governance structures in place, because you start, building the teams. You'll have more people on the ground. You might have to start hiring, and then so on, right? So I think then the structures start to evolve, and then you need to think about, do you need people locally? Or can you rely
Mm.
on partners, and then so on, right? Because again, as I said earlier, our knowledge of the market is limited. We've read about it, we've seen things, we've heard about from other companies, and so on. But when you actually start doing it, then we hit the ground realities, right? So I think that's where the partner model really helped us, because they opened up, we learned a lot from them, and so on. But then there are also, in some of the markets that you go into, even Singapore, there are statutory minimums in terms of, local versus foreign employees, right? If you have to get a work permit there, there's a minimum number of people that you need to hire locally, and so on, right? So for that reason, I think on one hand, yes, you need that local knowledge. It's good to have local people also, but then, in terms of bridging the gaps, bridging the cultural barriers, and so on, it's always good to have a mix there, right? But then there are limits imposed by regulation as well, right? So we need to consider all of that when it came to that.
Shavan, you mentioned um, that it was still one P&L, but internationally they were you guys were operating as through this partnership model, right? How did you maintain like alignment between your Sri Lankan operation and all these international um, uh, new entities, I guess, right?
Yeah, yeah. So at the start, again, I think we were trying to do a lot of it from Sri Lanka itself, right? We identified the partners. It was basically a lot of Zoom calls, Teams calls, etc. Trying to get to know these people whenever we could. Again, I think given the country situation at the time, we had challenges. We couldn't get out of the country, right? I think there were commercial considerations and all that, so the travel was limited, right? So a lot of it had to happen online. Um, uh, so I think those were some of the challenges, but I think it came down to the having the right people have those initial conversations as well. We did a couple of hires here locally of people, who had struck those channel partnerships, who had done certain things in the past, right? So I think, and it was about building the relationship, but it was slower than expected because it was all remote, right?
Hmm.
But as and when the travel restrictions eased out and we were able to afford it and put in some investment there, we started traveling, and that's when the real change happened. Right? When you
Hmm.
start putting feet on the ground, really meeting these people face to face, building relationships, having a drink with them, and so on, things really start to change and start to accelerate, right? And it's a very different relationship that you start building when you start working face to face in these situations, right? And then eventually we started placing people on site, moving them
Hmm.
uh, to those markets permanently, right? Where they get to experience and spend a lot more time in the market with prospects, with partners, with principals, and so on. And then that accelerated even further, right? But in the process, I think what is also needed is having people from your local operation, right, who's part of the heritage, if you will, for the company, to be part of this journey, right? Because
Hmm.
they know how to navigate the internals of the company, right? And if there are any gaps, they know how to bridge it, right? So you need that, and that's a very significant part of it, right? So a lot of people who were leading some of these efforts and so on were people who are just maybe traveling back and forth, right? Where there's a learning element for them when they go on site, from a customer perspective, understanding the requirements, the context, and so on. But then try to map it back into how we do things and how to get this and how to get it delivered, right? If you have someone totally new there who doesn't know the company, I think that's going to
Mm.
create a lot more challenges.